Good evening. Once again, as Jacob said, I want to welcome everyone here tonight. Hope you've had a good day, good afternoon, and thank you for being with us as always to our regular members, and of course, as always, to our visitors as well. I want you to know that you're always our honored guests. Hope everybody stays safe tonight from the weather. Hopefully, it won't be too bad tonight as we leave here today. But as always, God is in control, and that's we have to keep our faith in. Tonight, we're going to continue our series on women of the Bible and looking at various women that play a big role in regards to women of faith, women who are faithful to God, and again, examples that we could look up to. This was a series I started last month. We kind of got a slow start on because of several things that popped up, sickness in my family and other things, but we've looked at 3 women so far, one from the New Testament, 2 from the Old Testament. And tonight, you're going to get a 2-for-1 special because we're going to look at Mary and Martha, the story of Mary and Martha. If you want to go ahead and be turning in your Bibles to Luke chapter 10, that's where we're going to be starting tonight. All passages will be on the board tonight that we're going to look at, but as always, you can follow along in your Bibles, and that's where we're going to be referencing from tonight. We're going to be looking at 2 different women tonight. We see Mary and Martha. We're going to look at who they are, why they're important, and look at why I've chosen them for the lesson tonight. We're going to see a tale of 2 different women here, 2 different intentions, both who are faithful in their own ways. And we're going to start by looking at, first of all, who were they? If you're not sure who Martha and Mary are, or Mary and Martha, then we see them mentioned in several different passages in the New Testament. I've chosen 2 tonight to focus on. And where we first look at it and know about them is Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38. It says that they were traveling along, he entered the village, talking about Jesus. And a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who was also seated at the Lord's feet and was listening to his word. We see that Mary and Martha are sisters. And we know that at some point in time, Martha is going to invite Jesus into her home. So we see they live in the city of Bethany, and that she is going to welcome Jesus into her home. So we see we had a set of sisters live in Bethany who, at least on one occasion, invites Jesus into their home. We see that Mary was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word as Martha welcomes him in. We also see a story of Mary and Martha if we look at John chapter 11. And John chapter 11, look at verse 1. It says, "Now there was a certain man sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he who you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, the sickness is not meant for death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." So again, we see Mary and Martha as sisters. We know that they have a brother named Lazarus. And I think that we all kind of know where that storyline is going to of the Lazarus that we're talking about here. But I want to focus on verse 5 here. It says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." We see that these are not just 2 random women that are in Jesus' life. These are not just 2 women that we hear about just once and then move on. We see that these were 2 women that Jesus loved. And not necessarily in a romantic nature, but we see that all 3 of them Jesus loved as brothers and sisters as we continue on with that story. So we have an idea about who these people are. Again, Mary and Martha being sisters, they have a brother named Lazarus. And again, they were obviously very close to Jesus in regards to a love for one another. The primary story that I wanted to focus on tonight is the one based in Luke chapter 10. So I want to go back and look at what happens there as Martha invites Jesus into her home. And we look at verse 39. It says, she had a sister called Mary, who was also seated at the Lord's feet and was listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. And she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do the serving by myself? Then tell her to help me. See, what's happening here is that Martha has invited Jesus into her home, and it was customary at the time for Martha to take care of Jesus, to take care of all the servants, to take care as hostess, and taking care of all those duties. And as we see there in verse 39, we see that Mary was seated at Jesus' feet. She wasn't helping, she was listening to Jesus. And Martha's pleading to Jesus, saying, please tell her to come help me. But as we see here in verse 41, the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. But only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, this is a story that I believe we'll look at a good bit. And a story that, I'll be honest, I went back and looked at a couple of commentaries and articles in preparation for this. Because as we look at it here on the surface, we see that Martha is kind of complaining to Jesus as in, hey, I'm doing my job here, I'm helping out. Mary's sitting over there listening to you, can't you come help me? And instead, Jesus says, Mary has chosen the good part, meaning that she's doing what she's supposed to be doing. And if we look at this on the surface, we see that Martha's kind of taking it back or putting her place or whatever you want to call it, when really what she's doing here is her job as a hostess. I think that oftentimes the wrong message kind of gets pointed out here. Because the question here is, Martha was doing her job, so why was she wrong? Again, as was custom at this point in time, Martha was playing the hostess. And she's saying, Mary's not helping, she's over there listening. How many times have you been in this situation? Where you've been at work or maybe at home or wherever, and you're doing all the work and somebody else is just slacking off. And you're saying, man, I wish that somebody would get on and come help me out. And that's kind of what Martha's doing here. So is Martha wrong in what she's doing? The question here is it really the work that she's doing that was wrong? Or was it where her priority was? And that's really where Jesus' answer came from. In that Jesus says, you're worried and distracted by many things, but only one thing is necessary. Not necessarily that Martha was doing the wrong thing, but again, looking at what should be taken priority here. Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Not that Martha was doing anything wrong, but her focus wasn't necessarily on the right place. And oftentimes we look at the question here, did Jesus rebuke her? And I don't really think that that's the case here. I think that Jesus was just plainly pointing out here, and that Mary is listening to me, and that's really what should be priority. I think there's a bigger lesson here in looking at what should be our priority. Should it be all the other things that maybe doesn't really matter when it comes down to it? Or really should it be focusing on God and Jesus, which always matters no matter what? I think that's the bigger story here. Not necessarily that Martha was doing the wrong thing, but rather her focus was on the wrong thing. Her focus was on her job, her hostess, and not necessarily on the fact that Jesus was there. You ever seen a hostess or a host, and you got people over and they're going back and forth and they're working and they're doing all these different things? And are they really sitting down and paying attention and fellowshipping with those that are there? Or are they really just going back and forth and working and doing all these things? If Martha is doing all that, then it means that she can't be focused on what Jesus is saying or talking about. And that's what Mary is doing. So again, not necessarily that Martha was completely wrong in what she was doing. Rather, she just wasn't realizing what the importance was. She wasn't realizing what she really should have been doing, which was just listening and being with Jesus. We see here that Martha and Jesus had a very close relationship. As we look at chapter 10, verse 41, Jesus' answer here, the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. I read something interesting in preparation for this lesson, and that there's only a few times in the Bible to where a person's name is said twice in a row, like you would see right here. I want to say maybe 7 or 8 times. And with people that you would think about, Moses and Abraham, Martha is the only woman mentioned in this fashion. And the point that was made there is that you see the relationship between Jesus and Martha. Again, not necessarily that Jesus is rebuking her or really calling her out. But again, we see a woman here that Jesus cared deeply about. We see a close relationship here. Martha, Martha, you're worried. Again, I see this more along the lines of hey, you're worried about stuff that really doesn't matter right now. She is. And so we see a little bit about the relationship between Martha and Jesus. As we look at John chapter 11, and we'll continue with that story, then we see more interaction between Martha and Jesus. John chapter 11, starting in verse 17, says, so when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Talk about Lazarus. Lazarus has died. He's been dead for 4 days. Jesus has come back into Bethany. Verse 18, now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 15 stadia away. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. So then Martha, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. We see that Martha is the one that comes out to meet Jesus, not Mary. We see a woman that out of the two sisters, she maybe either is the older one or is the one that takes more of a leadership position. We saw that in regards to it's her home that she invited Jesus into. We see that in regards to she's the one that comes out to meet Jesus after the death of her brother. But it's really what she says here to Jesus that I want to focus on. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. We see that Martha certainly had faith in Jesus. We see that Martha, again, is there pleading with Jesus. If you had been here, you would have died, but I know that whatever you ask. And Jesus is going to reply here in that his death is not going to be permanent. And we see Martha's reply being in that she believes that what Jesus is talking about here is that Lazarus will arise in the last days for the judgment. We see that she really doesn't understand exactly what Jesus is going to be talking about. So again, we see the relationship between Martha and Jesus as being two people who are very close, and again, not romantically, but as brother and sister. That when her brother is dead, she goes out to meet Jesus, and she is upset, she is sorrowful, and that Jesus is going to try to comfort her in the best way that he can. We see that both sisters were loved by Jesus. As we continue in John chapter 11, verse 28, says, when she had said this, she left and called Mary her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and calling for you. And when she had heard this, she got up quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still at the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house were consoling her. When they saw that Mary had gotten up quickly and left, they followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to weep there. So when Mary came to the place where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We see both sisters saying the same thing. If you were here, you wouldn't have died. Again, we see two women here who had a lot of faith in Jesus. No doubt they had seen Jesus perform miracles. They knew that if Jesus was there, he could have prevented Lazarus from dying because he had that kind of power. We see both women saying the same thing. If you were here, you wouldn't have died. Verse 33. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he says, where have you laid him? They said, Lord, come and see. In verse 35, Jesus wept. We see that this is a passage, this is a story where we have that famous two-word verse, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. I think what's more important than just the fact that it's the shortest verse is looking at the fact that Jesus is showing human emotions. We see a case here where, again, Jesus came down in human form. He grew up, he was born, and he was raised in a human body, having all the same things as hunger and pain and all those other things. And here we see emotion coming up to Jesus. That as Jesus knows what's about to happen, he says, show me where you've laid him. Jesus knows what's going to happen. Jesus knows that he's going to go. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, that he's going to be alive again. But it says that he wept anyway. That's because of his love for this family. Because of his love for Martha and for Mary and for Lazarus. And because of the emotion they see of everyone around. And because they're so upset. Have you ever gotten upset because you see somebody else crying? It's emotional. Especially with people that you love very dearly. And that's exactly what we see out of Jesus. Again, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were all loved by Jesus. This was a family that Jesus was very close to. And when he sees that they're upset, that he gets upset as well. So we see that this close relationship brings out the human emotions in Jesus, and that he weeps. And then he goes to the tomb. And we know that from their point in time, he's going to help Martha and Mary. As we see as we continue, verse 38. So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days. I think this is a very important detail in the story. The man's been dead for 4 days. He is decaying. She says, if we remove the stone, it's going to stink in there. This could be an awful stench because his body has already been decaying 4 days. And that only gives more proof to power of Jesus as what happens next. Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone, and Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, but I knew that you would always hear me. Nevertheless, because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." Out came the man who had died, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped with cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." These two sisters have come out to Jesus. Their brother has died. They're upset. They're saying, "If you had been here, you wouldn't have died." But what does Jesus do? Jesus goes to the tomb. A man who'd been dead for 4 days, again, raises him from the dead. Raises him from the dead, rather. And he says here, he cries out to God. It says, Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you have heard me, but I knew that you always hear me. Because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." You see, also part of what Jesus is doing here is that Jesus is proving his powers to those standing around. See, Jesus knew that Lazarus was dead. He knew that Lazarus was going to die. This is only part of the plan of Jesus proving who he was and showing the powers of what he had. And it was this family that this story was made so. We see that he helps Martha, and Mary, and of course their dead brother Lazarus, and rising him from the dead. All within this same family that we see. Again, great love for these two women and for their brother. We see Jesus so moved by their sorrow that he, in turn, breaks down in tears. That again, he has come to help them, and that's exactly what he was going to do from the beginning. When he told the apostles that Lazarus was asleep, they thought he was literally sleeping. He said, "No, he's died. We're going to go back." Again, Jesus knew what he was going to do. These two women really didn't. Again, when Martha first spoke to Jesus saying that Lazarus was dead, Jesus says that he will rise again. She thought that he was meaning at the end of times. She really didn't quite understand the power that Jesus really had. I'm sure that she saw miracles of him healing the sick. But as far as raising somebody from the dead, again, a man who had been dead for 4 days, this was further proof to those people as to who Jesus was. Part of that plan in Jesus in his teachings here on earth. As a wrap up the lesson, we got two different stories, 3 main points. Number 1, we see that Martha was too focused on the wrong thing. Again, if we go back to the original story, really that I was going to focus on tonight, I ended up adding in both stories, but the original story that I was focusing on tonight was Martha hosting Jesus and Mary at Jesus' feet. We see that again, Martha was focused on the wrong thing. Not that Martha was doing anything wrong, not that she was necessarily committing something that was considered a sin, but rather she wasn't focused on what was the right thing, and that was Jesus right there with her, listening to Jesus. I don't have any idea what he was saying, but obviously it was important enough to where, again, Mary was there, and that's where Mary should have been. Again, Martha was focused on the wrong thing. This gives proof that just because we're doing something that may not necessarily be wrong, is our mind in the right place? Are we always focused on Jesus? We have to always put our attention on Jesus. Put our attention on Jesus. Several typos here. All right, put our attention on Jesus. We see here that no matter, sometimes we may not necessarily be doing anything wrong, but are we truly putting Jesus and God first? That's what we see here with this story with Martha. Again, she wasn't necessarily doing anything wrong, but she wasn't putting first what should have been first, and that was just being with Jesus. We know that Jesus is not going to be there forever. We see that Mary, in turn, sat and listened to Jesus. She recognized that listening to Jesus was more important. Don't think that Mary was being lazy by any means by not helping out. Rather, she recognized what she should have been doing, and that was, here is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has all these powers. This is where I should be. And so, therefore, that's why Jesus says Mary has chosen the better. Mary's doing what she's supposed to, and I will not bring her away from that. You know, that's not the only time that Mary was gotten on to. As we continue in John chapter 12, We see that in the days before the Passover, that Jesus comes in and Mary is going to wash Jesus' feet with this expensive perfume, and Judas rebukes her for using the expensive perfume and not going out and selling it, giving it to the poor. And at that time, Jesus also defends Mary, and that she realizes that I'm not going to be here forever, so therefore let her be. We see Jesus defending Mary on a couple of occasions. Again, because her attention, her mind is focused on him. Our minds have always got to be focused on Jesus first and foremost. Our minds have always got to be put on God first and foremost at all times. And then third, Jesus loved Martha and Mary, both of them. He cried when Mary pleaded him again, Martha first, and then Mary. And then at that point, Jesus let his emotions get to him because of his love for them, because he was moved by those who were upset by the passing of Lazarus. And then raised Lazarus from the dead, showing his true powers. You see, he used their brother as an important example as to how powerful he really was. They both had faith in him. Neither one of them really doubted him. But I don't think really understood the true powers that Jesus had when he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Again, even Martha said he's been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said, move the stone. And he raised Lazarus from the dead to show his powers. We see here that these are just two examples that I'm using tonight. Martha and Mary mentioned several times throughout the New Testament. We see two women here that, again, we see several examples of that we could take as great examples of people who were close to Jesus. Again, they had obviously done a lot of right things because Jesus trusted them. Jesus loved them. And even though Martha kind of gets caught in the wrong place a couple of times, we see that these are people that Jesus loved dearly because they were faithful to him. They welcomed him in. They were close to him. They were there with him all the way to the end. And that's what we've got to be as well. We've got to be that kind of mindset with Jesus and with God. And that no matter what, we always turn our attention to them. Understanding the power of them. And sometimes, even when we don't understand what's going on, even when we don't understand certain passages or understand maybe even the total plan, our faith is in them, knowing that we've got to follow their lead, just like Mary did. We see two sisters here who, again, we look at as great examples of faith. Both went about two different ways that they can get happen. But again, two women of faith that, again, were very close to Jesus all the way through the end. As we close out this lesson tonight, I want to focus really on the thing that Jesus told Martha in Luke chapter 10. Is our mind in the right place? Is our mind always with Jesus? Is our mind always on God? And again, maybe we're not necessarily doing anything that's bad or wrong, but are we really focusing on God at all times? Are we focused too much on the things out there and not enough on the things in here? Are we focused too much on other outside factors, or are we focused on serving God at all times? And again, life can be very difficult. It can be very confusing in regards to making sure that we're taking care of everything else in our lives. But the question is, are those things taking us away from God? Those household duties were taking Martha away from Jesus. She needed to be with Jesus. Are our outside factors taking us away from God? Is there anything in our lives that's taking us away from God, just like what's happening to Martha? Or rather, are we sitting at Jesus' feet every minute, every moment of every day like we need to be? Are we sitting at the feet of God, listening to the commandments, following the commandments, being as faithful as we possibly can be? Or do we find ourselves from time to time getting up and maybe focusing on other things when Jesus is right there in the room and we should be with him instead? I know I've been guilty of that a lot, especially here lately. But this is a moment for us to reflect on. And for anybody here who is here tonight, who maybe you've been away from Jesus for too long, then we need to make sure that we get that correct. Whether it's someone here who's not a Christian, or someone here who is a Christian, but maybe, again, our focus from time to time is just taken away from Jesus and God a little too much. Maybe it's taken us away to the point where it's affected our faith and affected our ability to be faithful to God and to Jesus. If that's the case, we need to make sure that we correct that tonight. If there's anyone here who needs to become a Christian, who needs to get forgiveness of sins, or maybe who needs to come back to God, we can do that right now. But make sure that we always take the lead of what Mary was doing, always following Jesus, always being right there at him, and always having our faith in him. Because if we expect to get to heaven, if we expect to get the kind of judgment that we need to have and that we want to have, then we got to be just like Mary, right there at Jesus' feet at all times. If we can help anyone in any way, please come as we stand and as we sing.
Number 366, I wrote down wrong numbers, sorry, now.